originally in Spanish. When I speak in absolute terms, stating my point of view as if it were absolute or solid truth, I am referring to how I see things from my particular point of view and from my experience. It is a form of linguistic expression and not an imposition on my part, so that you believe what I say and not the views or versions of others. I state things from my point of view based on everything I have learned, experienced, and everything that comes into my head constantly. I only share it with all of you as a reference so that you have more information or as a stimulus to think about during the process of forming your personal and particular cosmogony. An example of this is when I state that every conscious being, at whatever level, is composed of consciousnesses of lesser cognitive and awareness evolution, and in turn forms more complex beings as well. That is, there is a range of consciousness that goes from very simple to the absolute, the original source, or whatever you wish to call it. This is also a limited way of explaining something that is simply impossible to explain, since any theory or empirical statement that we develop from our evolutionary position of mind, whatever level it may be, will fall short, since from the point of view of the absolute, nothing we say will represent the objective reality of how the absolute works. It is simply unattainable from our levels of mind and consciousness. Having said that, I describe it to you as a range of mind consciousness that goes from little to almost nothing, in a cumulative gradient all the way to the all, the original source. Being that this again would be an explanation perception from a non-total point of view, since from the point of view of the absolute, of the source, there is and could only be a single mass impossible to describe, which includes everything. And I mean everything in the absolute sense of the word everything. Being that any point in between or any concept that attempts to describe it, such as my previous gradient of consciousness going from the lowest to the source itself, remains as a concept or an idea contained within the sea of thoughts that are and that form the all. All that exists, has existed, and will exist is contained in a single mass, atemporal, without specific time, and without locality. They are ideas in one great total mind. With this as a basis, it is obvious that all things are connected to each other, and even more so, all minds of thinking creatures as well. Again, only ideas contained in the mass of the all. Extending the latter, the classical concept that biology is life, and the energetic and mineral world only forms life as building blocks or ingredients necessary for its formation, remains as one more simplistic explanation, being that everything that is perceived from the material world point of attention of a classical life of a Lyrian-based person in low densities, like 3D or 5D, misnamed and only mentioned as a crude reference, everything that is visible, be it pure energy, be it a grain of sand, a nucleus of atom, electron, and whatever you can think of, everything is a being, everything is thinking, and everything is someone with mind and consciousness. As I have explained, simple beings form more complex beings, always. The New Age concept that says we are all connected and that we are all one stretches and falls short in extreme simplicity and pales with how it really is, meaning that all beings, living or not, all there is, again with the most expanded meaning of the word all, are parts or particles of consciousness that not only form what from one point of view or another is a more complex being, but are in itself the all and the original source itself. From a grain of sand or an electron to an entire galaxy or more, they are, and I affirm it, holographic fragments of the original source that contain all its attributes by right. And this again remains as one more way of explaining the inexplicable. There is no material world and spirit world. There are no other dimensions, no alternate timelines, no parallel universes, no densities. They are all concepts and ideas trying to explain something too big to be understood from lower levels of existence consciousness, being that this is also another concept, another idea. Because as I said above, all there is and can be is already the all. Everything there is, and all of us in general, are ideas. We are an attachment to a set of concepts that define our boundaries, which are subsequently non-existent. The attachment to the concept of everything that each person understands as what defines him or her, everything that he or she includes as part of that person, including the conscious part and the unconscious part alike, including what we reject as us, forms the I. And the attachment to the I could be defined as the ego. And they are nothing more than the attachment to ideas, concepts and beliefs that everyone has. Has as a soul also, without the religious charge, being that a soul is not something. It is only formed by a group of ideas within the great mind in the form of a constant. A node formed by stationary waves with a specific harmonic that keeps them adhered to each other, forming what could be said to be a person, a particular individual. Each individual, each person, by having attachments to these ideas, will irremediably create a mental filter where he will not be able to see or interpret his environment except through the lens of his attachments and ideas, rejecting everything that does not fit his particular concept of who he is. A person's outer world is only a reflection of who he is, but I state it as an absolute. It is the person, not reflecting from within his being to create an outer world or environment as the New Age tries to explain, but the outer world in perception of each person is the person himself, without boundaries, as if he lives in a place being something smaller, contained in that place or world environment. The person himself is his environment, and his environment is the person, who in turn is defined through the lens of what he rejects and what he includes in his own definition of I, that will form attachments to ideas called ego. From this point, I attempt to explain to you why there isn't and cannot be material world and spiritual world, nor can there be time, nor space, nor distances. All are ideas and attachments to concepts contained in the personal definitions of those who have an I and an ego. The body itself is only a manifestation of a group of ideas, and it is what shapes the illusion of being in an outer world, when the person consciousness is its outer world. The concept that each individual person forms his own world in a particular way and adds to the collective thought that shares his ideas to a greater or lesser degree, forming a shared outer world, without being entirely non-valid, is really just another effort to explain that simply each person consciousness is all there is, contained and illusorily limited by a lens or a container limiter of worlds called attachment to that which defines his own existence and individuality, his group of ideas that form his self and ego, and his attachment to them. That is what limits or creates the illusion of being limited, that there are universal material or physical laws that are unbreakable. It is just more ideas and attachments to such concepts. Moving on to time, it can never be a constant, nor can it ever be something apart from the mind. It is simply the evolutionary process with which thought unfolds. It is the result of the internal dialogue of a mind. It will always be relative. It will always be plastic. Time is you and your ideas, and where and how you process them. Your attachments to the possible and the impossible to achieve are attachments to yourself and your ego, and you do not discard them for fear of losing individuality, for fear of losing what defines you. And that is what stops your your mental expansion. space, distances are based on time. Because without measure, there is no distance. It depends on time. So they are ideas. Same for energy and matter. Illusory interpretations. They are just ideas seen through the lens of other ideas that define them as something and not something else. And to explain this, the body as such is a good example. Because if there is a body, then there is matter. If there is sensation of heat or cold, there is energy. And if I am born, live, and die, there is time. Again, concepts and attachments, sustaining more concepts and attachments. So there can be no life. There can be no death. There can be no time. There can be no distance and no space. Everything is contained as ideas flowing in one great mind, which is you, the whole, which is each one of us, including the grains of sand. We are all one from the most expanded point of view. One, the source. Each person that in your perception is other is only there because you have the idea that it is there by use and through attachments to the concepts of yourself and ego that you do not let go of even when you do want to let go of them. So everything, person, mineral, energy, plant or animal you encounter is you again, always in the eternal now, beyond time and space. There is no death. There is no life. Only more concepts and attachments to them. Let us speak now from the point of objective observation of someone who analyzes people who say they are alive. From their group of attachments that define them, with their I and their ego, it is perfectly valid to see that there is life and there is death. I am not speaking now from the more expanded point of view, but only from the objective point of view of that group of ideological limitations called incarnation. There, of course, there is life and death as experiences. It hurts to lose loved ones, and it is abusive to say there is no death. But there is more to it. The group of ideas that maintains the perceived concept of being alive is congruent to attachments to laws that determine that something, that it killed you. But what formed you is there, your mind, your ideas, and even yourself and ego. Just as you formed the seemingly external concept of the material world, you will form the spiritual world as well, the afterlife, the world of the dead, the between life, or whatever you wish to call it. Your world, material or not, is formed by your ideas and your attachments to them. That is why I affirm that who you are is how you live, and it is your world, including what you reject, not only what you like and love, that is inclusive of your acceptance of it, person or thing, into you, because it helps you to define who you are, to define yourself and your ego. when you die, you leave a group of ideas that form your material world. And in the exact same way, you will form your afterlife. I insist, not as something outside of you, but as what you already are. Your world, your environment is formed by you because it is you. Whatever you have, whatever you think, your values, your attachments, your concepts, your ethics and spirituality, that is you. And you take it with you when you die, forming other realities, your spiritual world, your afterlife. That is why there is a world of the dead, mirror of the material one. Same streets, same people, same map, because they are the attachments of the people who have left their concepts of material world, forming a mirror world, that by the art of their own thoughts, which are the person himself, that do not let him transcend to form other more expanded realities, they attach to form a world almost like the real material one, but in a decadent and dreary way mostly. Equally beautiful and tranquil worlds will form, full of peace and beauty, and every variant in between. And this is also another set of ideas, which I insist I am sharing with you with no intention to impose anything. Forget basic concepts such as karma, cause and effect, and the like. They serve to explain things from one or another level of consciousness thought. You only need to know that your environment is you, and that what limits you are your ideas and your attachments to them, which form yourself, your ego. Especially the parts you don't like about your environment, because they are the parts you don't like about you. That is why you should never be afraid to face your fears and what you dislike about yourself, because you only bury it in the unconscious, material unconscious and adamatic spiritual unconscious, that forms who you are in life and not your misnamed soul. You are everything. You form everything. The only thing that limits you are your ideas and your attachment to them. There are no pasty densities where manifestation is slow, excuses and attachments to them. Everything is one mass, the original source, that is you. Whether or not it frustrates you to see results or not, whether or not you reject your world because it doesn't fit into your ideas of who you are, yourself and your ego, whether you like it or not, that is also you. You can only face it without fear. But facing yourself is the key, always. That is the problem. Your attachments to yourself and your ego, the root of all your problems. Moving further up, I describe multiple things from multiple points of view that many times not only appear to be contradictory, but are contradictory. This is because existence itself is composed of contradictions, where, as concepts, everything is valid, more so from the point of view of the absolute, where everything is integration. Therefore, integrating the valid and the invalid, the false with the true, since they only end up being ideas within a mind that tries to classify them on one or the other side of duality, using values and ideas that are limited by the borders of the observer's consciousness, which in turn is defined by his attachments to what defines him as an I and as an ego, and is further defined by what he rejects as definitions of himself. Being that here, with full intent, I describe and use self and ego as manifestations in duality of one and the same person, present in all except Source, as it is all. From this position, I now describe to you why, for me, from my particular point of view, there are no densities or timelines, no parallel universes, nor anything that is defined as an existential realm, shared or not. Before, my counterparts, my other versions of myself, my friends and other people, have described, among 1,000 other theories, that the universe is made of existential densities, ranging from the simple to the complex. First, they have listed them as in 1D, 2D, 3D, and so on up to 12D or at infinity. Then it has been described as a gradient that rises from the low, which would be the 1D, mineral realm, to any high density, usually 9D or 12D, as in a graph that rises from the simple to the complicated, like a tape measure where each person's point of attention, consciousness, will determine from where to where they will perceive as their existential world, the real, the possible, and the not possible. While these concepts are still valid from an explanatory point of view, as a beginning of understanding, it is time to advance towards descriptions that are more in line with what I personally perceive as my views, that I share with you in an explanatory way without any desire to impose anything. Every self-aware person is not a unit, but the result of the sum or amalgamation of simpler consciousnesses that share by agreement similar perceptions, but never the same. I define simpler consciousnesses from the comparative point of view to what they form when they get together, a consciousness with a more expanded range of understanding and perception. So, no one is a person. No one is a soul, but we are all a collection of sums of other people who compose us and constantly feed our consciousness in an endless stream of gravity, of consciousness flowing and coming together in nodes that we call people. The simple ones will form colonies of mutual cooperation, which in turn will form more complex ones. Perfect examples of this are the cells in the body, which have their own life cycle, their own perception, including their own internal organs and reproductive system and primitive brain in the cell membrane. They come together by compatibility of attributes in an organized manner to form a more complex organism called a body, whether human or not. Same way with consciousnesses. Since above or previously I have explained that there is no material world, but only a set of attachments to ideas that, by their determination to remain as laws, have imposed the perception that there is matter, being that everything from the beginning was always an idea. So each person point of attention consciousness is formed by other simpler persons, and these by others with simpler perception and consciousness, and so on upwards, forming more complex beings until reaching the original source. So each person with consciousness is in himself, for me, a whole universe. And for that person, the whole universe, his own timeline, and his own perfectly valid perception of all there is, and of all that is possible and not. On the other hand, I see time as a direct result of the consciousness processes of each individual, and dependent on his level of thought and personal expansion. And your perceptions of distance and speed will depend on your temporal perception and everything else that defines it. For speed and distance depend on time, and time on perception. I see the points of attention consciousnesses as living not in densities or dimensions, not in tape measure gradients, but in a series of bubbles containing their limits of consciousness perception. Bubbles formed by other bubbles, feeding one another in a constant flow of gravity consciousness in the sea that is the ether, which itself is formed by them. Bubbles of their own, singular and unrepeatable, containing everything that defines them as someone, what they want to see as what defines them, and what they reject as what defines them as well. Sea of bubbles of consciousness that, being singular, touch one another. Parts are shared, and these parts are the agreements of perception between people or groups of people. With this description, I am trying to give shape to something impossible to describe with words, since obviously any description that I or anyone else tries to give will fall short of what it really is. It is not even how I see things. I'm just trying to describe these mental concepts I have in something tangible to share. I refer to bubble as a container of something inside that itself has a boundary, the membrane of said bubble. Inside as a sphere, I see it as containing everything a person has that defines them as someone in particular. As I have said before, what he accepts and loves and what he rejects equally, all defining himself into an I, positive side, and an ego, negative side, in an individual point of conscious attention. In this case, this bubble individual will touch others and will have shared perceptions with those other bubble individuals that are the common areas to share. And it is not placed on any scale of densities, as I see all people, to one extent or another, depending on the lens through which one looks, existing in every possible density, with every possible range of intelligence, of thought, and of consciousness, all simultaneously, where there are no bubbles other than more concepts, as an attempt to give form to something intangible and impossible to define, as our best attempts will always fall short. An attempt to explain the infinite, that which escapes all possible concepts of thought. But in the end, it is all a single mass of consciousness that is defined as multiple individual persons only by attachments to one or another sequence of ideas. And it is the ideas that limit the persons and form them as such. The idea of having a limit, that you start and end somewhere. All that can exist is consciousness. The rest is illusory. Only attachments to characters created by that same total cosmic mind. So there can be no death from one's own point of view, since this is only the resolution of a sequence of ideas that define what an incarnation is. Death can only exist in the mind of the living. Death only exists as such in the minds of the living. You and I and everyone else are only the egregor that is formed by our attachments to our ideas. You can only fear death while you are alive. Then you will know why not. It is perfectly valid to fear death while alive. That as duality defines life itself. There cannot be one without the other. Besides, as people who are alive, we see and feel and suffer death all the time around us. Even more so if it happens to a loved one. But it is only valid as long as you are alive. And it is only valid while being in an incarnation without memory of past lives. Since death there represents the dissolution, the destruction of the I and the ego. This being only illusory, since what formed the I and the ego, those same ideas and those same attachments to them, existed before what is called incarnation, and will continue to exist afterwards as well. The accumulation of experiences is inevitable as we live through incarnations, but they can only be fully experienced without a total memory of all that we have been before and all that we have ever been. Because if the memory were total, we would be the original source, which we are at the same time, being everything. As all-inclusive, this is reflected in the idea of having a limited incarnation in a time frame with certain rules of possible and not possible, created by ourselves. Death is undeniable. To fear it is a choice. For if it is not feared while alive, death will lose its teeth, because there is nothing to fear ever. But also by choice, one can still be afraid of death while dead. Fear of death, reflected as in not desiring the dissolution of the self and ego, which would not happen anyway, as I have already explained. This forms the attachment to the idea or need to be in the world of the living, which creates from the spirit side equal or similar worlds where the discarnate live. Worlds manifesting from their perception, their limits, their eyes and egos, and their attachments to them all. Again, I use world of the living, world of the dead, and so on as explanatory expressions, and I do not contradict myself. As every world, existential realm, is by agreement between different points of attention consciousnesses that perceive themselves apart from each other by their attachments to what defines them, I do not see or perceive any difference between one realm or another as to their validity. I see them all as equally real. For example, the world of the living and the world of the dead in this case. They are all manifestations or elaborate egregors of a mind, which in turn is formed by others simpler in their thinking and understanding. That is, each realm density or existential world, each timeline, each parallel universe as such, is itself a person, individual. Simple consciousness individuals form other, more complex ones, and these other, more complex ones, each one from its level and from its point of attention, will be an entire universe. This is what I mean by bubbles without gradient, only formed by the addition of others. What I see and perceive, in short, is that there are no separate worlds, but a single existential mass, illusorily limited by the concepts and attachments of each point of attention consciousness. This means that the world of the dead and the world of the living and all other worlds overlap. There are no boundaries other than those generated by ideas. Each individual, wherever he may be or alive, on the side of the living or on the side of the dead or whatever, such as densities, timelines, parallel universes and the like, will define for himself from where to where and how far he will be able to perceive and function. By this I mean to explain why there are phenomena such as ghosts and entities, whether benevolent or dark, and all sorts of things, vermin and creatures described on earth as belonging to the lower astral, and also to higher realms or densities, to use common earth definitions. They are just all there. Sometimes by agreements to perceptual attachments, they are not seen. But precisely because of those qualities of existential bubbles overlapping each other, is why some of the creatures that should not exist in the physical world can sometimes be seen or interacted with, or they can alter the so-called physical world. It is just a soup of perception agreements. And from the physical body side of incarnation, this one serves as a filter to have the attention fixed just on living and existence with agreements that define it as world of the living. So each person, incarnate or not, will have their own self-imposed limits that prevent or allow them to perceive and function in other existential realms. as there is a whole range of agreements, some people will be able to interact with the other side. And likewise, creatures and points of attention on the other side will be able to interact with the living side. All depending on the limits that each individual attention point has self-imposed because of the attachments to the ideas that define them as someone, define their self and ego. You do not see other worlds there or here or wherever, only because of your agreements of perception, because of your self-imposed limits, but they are there. Just because you can't see them, it doesn't mean they don't exist. Everything interacts with everything, all the time. The all, the entire universe, is the original source, one mass. That's why there are ghosts and entities and everything else that shouldn't exist. They are perceived by certain people by agreements, and agreements are ideas, and ideas are frequencies. That is why the individual frequency will define what is perceived, what is experienced. That's why certain people's agreements coincide with beautiful things, or others with ugly things, monsters, or whatever they see. But it will always be as a direct mirror or consequence of your thoughts and who you are. You are what you think. You have always been an egregor of your own creation. And you will always vary in your thoughts. Therefore, you will always vary in what you perceive. And therein lies the total control you have over your entire life and all that exists in it, your mind. Each being, each point of attention, each creature, mineral, plant, animal, will have its own way of interpreting the universe. It will have its own perception, its own level of consciousness, which is formed by its experiences, by what it has learned throughout its existence. And this is formed depending on the attachments to its ideas that it acquires, and with which it forms its self-concept, its self, its ego. The so-called material world, however each race interprets it, using humanity as an example, is only an interpretation specific to them, based on their perception and understanding. First on their limited five senses, and then the use of reasoning that tends towards the scientific. That is to say, that it already incorporates elements that it recognizes as existing truths in its reality with the use of scientific reasoning. An example of this are the radio waves. But it is still an interpretation specific to the human race. And equally, there will be other races, other beings, that will have other concepts entirely. Some will coincide with those of the human race, others will not. This is what I call bubbles that touch one another, which are the points where there are agreements of perception and understanding, scientific or not. But they are only points where they touch each other, with agreements that they share in one way or another. This is why I affirm that there are no existential densities as such, nor temporal lines, nor parallel universes, nor time or space. All this remains only as definitions within a framework of agreements of perception that support theories and ideas to which a being or a group of beings has generated a strong attachment because they strongly define their concept of self-identity. What they call densities, dimensions, temporal lines, time, parallel universes, are not something outside of them. You do not live in a dimension nor in a density. It is only a personal process of evolution of consciousness that each being must form by itself. It is as if the being itself is the density dimension itself, not that it lives within a density dimension, leaving that experience of living in one as an illusion that again is formed only by its ideas and its attachments to them. An example of the above are dimensions and densities. They go hand in hand because the higher the density, the more dimensions will be perceived, since a higher density will be reached by the accumulation of processed and incorporated knowledge with high understanding that the subject has incorporated to his self-concept that will define by attachments who he is, his self, his ego, and therefore expands what the being himself understands and perceives, which will form a sense of control over his life that will naturally increase his vibratory state. The very definition of densities between low-paced, slow, and fast, high ones, like it will depend on your low versus high vibrational state, is only one way of many to explain the universe, but it will never explain it completely. It is not just about vibration or speed as in the blades of a fan that are only blurred because they are moving very fast relative to the observer, whereas if the observer were spinning like the blades, the observer would see them stopped and everything else in the room would be blurred. Describing the point of view of the observer in the room or that of the observer spinning with the fan as different densities, where the point of attention of one or the other allows one to see and perceive things differently, preventing one from seeing the other perspective clearly. Needless to say that although the explanation is curious and helps to form a mental image of densities, it is far from being able to explain what really happens in the universe on this subject. It is just one more idea, another tool that allows us to understand more. But it is not the whole picture. Because from our point of observation, with this example of the room with the fan, we understand that this phenomenon does not involve densities, but perspective of movements only. Rather, a density can be explained as an accumulation of concepts and ideas that form attachments that will define the I and the ego of the observer subject, which, by simple expansion of understanding, will allow the observer subject to perceive more details, more data, which increases his perception of dimension on this density. The greater the density, the greater the complexity. Ergo, other dimensions are perceived. But not as if more things are perceived that were already there, but the very observer subject is the one who has expanded to form a more complex reality, richer in detail. This is why I insist that the so-called material world does not exist. That concept of material world, which will inexorably form its opposite, non-material world, is only an explanation contained within the group of agreements to which one or more points of attention consciousnesses have strong attachment, because it defines them, their self-concept, because it forms their self and their ego. But it will not include other points of view than their own, to the group that generates those ideas of perception. It is here that I try to explain to you how other beings have views, agreements, and perceptions that include other kinds of existential realities, not as living in them, but as being them. This includes discarnated ones with attachments to their life in the material world, who will have their attention overlapping between the so-called spiritual world or lower astral and the material world of the living, using understandable terms. These kinds of appearances of strange beings, entities, cryptozoology, ghosts, and all that is perceived to be there but should not be, I understand as being caused by all that I am trying to describe here now and in the past few days. There is only one universal mass of pure consciousness. Call it ether. Call it the original source. Everything else contained within it, holographic fragments, densities, dimensions, timelines, parallel universes, are or are only to be perceived by a being or a group of beings and their points of attention and their levels of consciousness. All of the above has been my effort to explain in limited words why there is no death, as this is only a limited concept within a framework of agreements that only reflect the eyes and egos of those who have certain agreed perspectives, the living. That is why there are countless material, real worlds, one for each being point of attention consciousness. That is why I have assured you that there is a timeline, a parallel universe, a density or dimension for each one of you, for each creature that exists.